I'll start just in the room. I can also see how many people have sailed on Waverley or have been aboard her in service. Right, so I've got a bit of a conversion to do to make sure you all want to go on Waverley. Because after all, she is in the city. So I'm going to go through a little bit of her history and then really what it is operating the world's last seagoing paddle steamer. You may come to the conclusion, as I often do, there's a good reason there's only one of these left, because running this is not particularly easy. But for me, that is the driver. I want to see Waverley sailing on our home waters, cruising the Kyles of Bute, having just left Tinnabrook Pier, if you just follow the wake back, where she looks good, she looks right for the setting, and paddle steamers have been doing that on the Clyde over 200 years since the very first one, 1812. So she's got a long line. She was really like the final effort in paddle steamer design on the Firth of Clyde, because she was the last steamer built for Clyde service. If you step aboard, then you will see this plaque displayed, noting that Waverley, the current Waverley, was built to replace the previous one of 1899 that was lost during the war at Dunkirk. She was evacuating troops from the Dunkirk, and unfortunately she came under attack and was sunk by enemy action. The master of the 1899 Waverley survived the sinking. There was an interview with him online, and he describes his only fear was he couldn't swim. And he took command of the new Waverley, which she entered service. So there was the 1899 Waverley, at speed, really getting it between her there. And that was her in war action, as many of the Clyde paddle steamers went off to act as minesweepers during World War II. So the current Waverley, her keel was laid in December 1945, really to be built to replace the fact that so many steamers had been lost during the war. Some did come back into service, but Waverley was to be the last built for Clyde service. She was hull number 1330, which you can just see to the bottom of the picture, and that's her being constructed on the site, which is now the Riverside Museum in Glasgow. So that was the shipyard of Angie Inglis Point House Yard. Waverley was built there. The yard had a long history of building paddle steamers and coastal vessels. Ship starts to look like a paddler when you can see here the paddle drums and the sponsons, which is really the paddle boxes, the width that a paddler has, and the space there for the boiler room space you can see open up. She was then launched in October 1946. Her engine, meanwhile, was being built, assembled, and then deassembled to go back to the ship, because she was then towed down to Greenock, and that's her engine in the Eagle Foundry in Greenock. And if you're ever aboard, you look at the crankshaft of the engine, there's an eagle on the top of each crank representing the Eagle Foundry. And in June 1947, she entered service. She entered service to operate from Craigendoran, which is in the north bank of the Clyde, near Helmsburgh, to cruise up Loch Long to Arica at the head of Loch Long. And that was the route that she was built for. That's her at Dunoon Pier, with her elder sister just off the picture, paddle steamer Jeannie Deans. Waverley and Jeannie Deans would look quite similar from a distance, but any steamer enthusiast will be able to tell the difference straight away. Jeannie had survived the war. She'd been built in the early 1930s, and she operated on the Clyde until the mid-60s when the paddlers were being lost and coming out of service. There had been an early attempt to preserve Jeannie on the River Thames. It lasted 2 years, and then financial ruin, and the ship went off to scrap. We still have a part of Jeannie Deans that sails with us, because her bell was saved, and we carry her bell on board. So an image of her in her first year. The funnels were red, white and black for 1 year only, 1947, because she was built for the London and North Eastern Railway. 1948, railways in the UK were nationalised. British railways came into being. Waverley lost her funnel colours, and it would be several years after that before they were returned. There's the funnels changing colour. It became what was called buff, so this a yellow colour with the black top. Things were changing after the war years. That was an image of her in the 1950s, sailing away from Dunoon on the Clyde. The centre of the ship, the paddle box here in this picture, you can see it's a bit rust stained, but notice that it's white. From a distance, when Waverley was painted with white paddle boxes, she would look less like a paddle steamer and slightly more modern vessel. So there had been a push to get her paddle boxes back to black, but there's quite an atmospheric picture with the smoke. She had been coal-fired for her first 10 years. So from 1947 to 57, she was coal-fired and then converted to heavy fuel oil. By 1972, when this image was taken, her status had started to build. By this time, she was the world's last seagoing paddle steamer, and interest was gathering around the ship. There was the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society members were taking an interest because Waverley was the last of the Clyde steamers. And they convinced the management of the company operating at that time to return her paddle boxes to black, because then she stood out as a Clyde paddle steamer. The following year, she entered into what was formed Caledonian McBrain, ferry operator. 1973 was the first year that Caledonian McBrain existed, and they operated Waverley for that year. So she had her Calmac funnels for 1 year in service. Unfortunately, it was clear that she was losing money. And despite a renewed interest in her, the fact she had the status within a big company that was ultimately government funded and operating key services, a paddle steamer that was aging and going to require further work and ongoing expense was going to go. So Waverley found herself laid up in the James Watt dock. The funnel caps are on, you can see there's covers over the funnels, and she was offered for preservation. There was two gentlemen that were key within the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society. One lived in Glasgow, and he got the phone call from the managing director of Calmac. Could you come down to the office in Gourock? Douglas, chap from the PSPS, the Preservation Society, assumed that we're really going to get given the bail and told Waverley's been withdrawn. He went down to the office, he was offered the whole ship for £1. So, in August 1974, Douglas to the left hand, and then the other chap was involved, Terry to the right. They were the two members of the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society that showed the interest. Douglas was gifted £1. It was handed back again, and he was then take ownership on behalf of the society, Waverley. So, this year will mark the 50th anniversary since Waverley was gifted for £1. Quite quickly, a public appeal had to be opened up, because initially it was thought it should be static. At least we've saved Waverley, she's not going for scrap. But there was a little bit of ambition. What if just one paddle steamer could be saved and just one Clyde steamer could be operated? So a public appeal was launched. The particular chap there was a personality in STV at the time, and he helped launch the appeal. The money did come in, and then it did allow Waverley to return to service. So in May 1975, with her red, white and black funnels restored, she was awaiting her first passengers. And that image is Glasgow. The photograph has been taken from the Kingston Bridge. If you know that area of Glasgow from old, then you've still got the Daily Record building, which is slightly moved downriver. That area has now no building at all, but it's just next to the Kingston Bridge. And in the very far corner, the building that you see just with the end is our office, and that became the Waverley office. It still is today. We've still got an office in Glasgow, but that was her on her first day. There was a bit of a celebratory atmosphere with the Strathclyde Police Band coming out. The people that sailed on that very first sailing were people who had helped in terms of giving materials at cost or supporting the refurbishment to get her back into service. There was many at the time thought maybe I'll get through a year. Maybe she'll last for a couple of years. And of course, we're about to hit, say, 50th anniversary since she was gifted. Our first sailing in, our first public sailing in preservation, she was full, and it didn't go to plan. Unfortunately, halfway through the day, a paddle broke, and she arrived back in Glasgow at 4 AM the day after she departed, with a lot of passengers disembarking at Gourock and getting a train which had been hired to bring people back to Glasgow. Douglas himself talks about that day. That was the day it became reality. We're now running a ship. And he himself thought that really was going to be a struggle. And he himself doubted that she would sail the following day. He said, I went down to Largs Pier. We were due to be sailing from Largs. He said, I expected to be telling people the reason why she's not coming. And he said, but I heard the paddle beat and she came round the day into Largs. And Waverley's preservation has been that effort, that determination, day after day. There will be knocks, there'll be situations come along. You've got to end up, go again. The ship has got to sail in order to survive. In the 70s, there was actually competition on the Clyde for cruising. There was Queen Mary, which you'll see there has the Calmac funnel. Now, Queen Mary had survived until 1977 in passenger service, and then the decision was made for her. She wasn't viable. But on that particular image shows the two ships were sailing from Glasgow. Waverley was attracting the footfall, and Queen Mary wasn't. The paddle steamer had the feel for the public. The sound of a paddle steamer, there's something more vibrant than on a paddler than there is just a turbine steamer. But it wasn't all plain sailing. 1977, she found herself on the Gantock's rocks just off Dunoon. You can see there her stern ended up going up onto the rocks. Passengers on board were all quickly taken ashore with other vessels coming in to help. It was the start of an ebb tide, so she was stuck, and she floated off on the high tide and then went to a nearby berth and then was filled with concrete over the part where she had damaged the hull. She was almost an insurance write-off, but she did live to sail again. It was about a 6-week repair carried out in the Govan docks in Glasgow, and she did sail again. But it was becoming apparent, the fact that she had got through those first early years of preservation, that her original boiler that had been installed in 1947 really didn't have much future. And if the ship was going to be able to continue, she needed a new boiler. So the funnels came off and the original boiler came out. And that photograph shows you the old boiler to the left and then the new boiler being installed. And it was immediate in terms of the fuel consumption going down. So the old boiler had actually been kept in steam and would be burning something through the night. And it would take days to be able to warm it up. Whereas with a new boiler, shut down at the end of the day, 20, 30 minutes fire in the morning, and you're back up to steam pressure. It's quite an interesting photo there because you see the funnels are just sitting on the quayside. And that's happening just, the old boiler was lifted out with what we call the Finnison crane in Glasgow. So it's just happening really in the city centre, just off the city centre. She did end up making her way to London. This particular was the first image of her arriving in London, because part of the problem of operating a steamship on the Clyde was that you're operating it maybe for a sort of 5-month period, but the shoulder seasons, spring and autumn, were never generating sufficient funds. So in an attempt really to try and sustain Waverley in terms of earning enough money through a shortened season to survive a winter, was spread her wings, in a sense, take her to other parts of the UK where there was a history of operating paddle steamers. London, 1978, Waverley made her way there, and the South Coast. It was a proven success straight away, the fact the number of passengers. But there was doubt, and in actual fact, the board of directors at the time were not convinced. But one director said, go, I'll give you a check, I'll back it. So it went. didn't need to check. She had ended up earning sufficient funds. So she has been going right round the UK to likes of South Coast, London, Bristol Channel. After being reboilered, she actually did 3 years where she did right round Britain. So she did reach the East Coast, but that was quite a difficult area to operate. There's not really enough ports and piers and estuary waters that give you good sailing conditions, and the weather's not always going to be against you. But she has been all the way around. Glasgow has changed, and if you know this area of Glasgow, it's, you know, there's a lot of difference obviously with the hydro, the exhibition centre, the hotels, but the crane still obviously remains. I'd say one of its final jobs, the crane, was removing Waverley's old boiler, but that was the mid-90s. So by this time, Waverley was in preservation for 20 years. She was well established, but the ship was approaching 50 years old. Again, that's her late 90s. But by then, it was accepted that, again, really there was going to have to be substantial investment in her if she was going to continue. And it was fortunate that there was the National Lottery, and they were giving big funding for heritage projects. And in a sense, Waverley won the lottery. Over 5 million across 2 different winter periods was given. Basically, essentially, it was the hull needing a lot of refurbishment. So she found herself in Great Yarmouth to undergo the first stage of the rebuild in 2000. And you can see in that photo, the paddle boxes are off, the paddles have been removed, because there was major refurbishment of the hull, including completely new paddle boxes. The main engine, the crankshaft, even came out. A picture of looking into the engine room where the crankshaft would have been. And then that boiler that you saw going in 1981, that then came out. She was then getting 2 new boilers, 2 smaller compared to the original one. And then to boiler room. Paddle wheel, when the paddles have been removed, ready to take the wheel off. The wheels had actually a lot of work done to them in the early 1990s and just needed refurbishment. There wasn't major work needed to them, but they come off the ship and then back on. But you can see that extensive hull replating was required in the way of the boiler room and engine room. But a part of the requirement with the Heritage Lottery funding was that the ship's hull was to be riveted. Now, it was only riveted from the waterline up to give her the appearance of a vessel, but it was also welded. So below the waterline was being welded, but above the waterline was being riveted. I think a bit of training was required in terms of getting someone that had experience of riveting to then be able to train workers in the yard. She has a very fine bow, and you'll also see there the bow lips up because her home base at Craigandorran, at low water, then she put the bow into the sand. And there was also another couple of piers in the Clyde, like Helmsborough and Millport, where at low water the sailors could put their bow into the sand, and she was just lipped for that. So the dry dock that she went into in Great Yarmouth wasn't wide enough to take her with the paddle boxes on. So the hull had been refurbished, the ship then refloated, and then the paddle boxes and paddles put back on. And you can see there the paddle box is starting to come on. It's at the port side there. And she got 2 new Cochrane boilers in 2000. So we're all right up to boilers 3 and 4 by the year 2000. She's a habit of eating through boilers or really getting through boilers. That photograph was taken 14 weeks before she entered service, having been rebuilt, and they've still got the funnels to go on, the superstructure aft deck, the paddle box is still being built on the port sides, the wheels are still to go back on. That's the paddle wheels. refurbished. So each paddle wheel has 8 floats. They are known as a feathering wheel because as the floats turn round, they hit the water at the best possible angle to give you the thrust. So as they go, the actual floats are moving independently, just so that you've got that best angle. And the wheel back it on with the structure built round about it. And 2 new funnels were constructed. The previous funnels had been steel, quite heavy. These ones were aluminium because at the rebuild, she was given double bottom in certain areas. So there was more steel going down below, but Waverley's always had a bit of a weight issue in the sense that if we put more weight on her, then it's less passengers. So to try and retain the passenger numbers, and she can carry currently up to 780, then you are wanting to make sure that she is not putting too much weight on. So those are some of the superstructure was aluminium up top after the rebuild. The new electrical switchboard in 2000, which of course looks a little bit older, but that was just part of the heritage feel of the vessel. We refitted that again in 2020, but we've kept the fascia so it still looks the part. It looks right somehow in Waverley's engine room, especially the big dial showing voltage current. So she started to come back to herself, undercoat on the hull. Well, I can see there the hull's still finished off, but she's certainly coming back to look like Waverley. And then she did sail from Great Yarmouth. The work had taken a little bit longer than had been initially planned, so it was actually the August that year before she entered service. The weather was such that it was more favourable to take her round the north, and she sailed from Great Yarmouth to come back to Glasgow. Then she called in at Aberdeen, and Kyle at Lochalsh for fuel, and then came back to Glasgow. I was, at that time, I was working on the ship. I actually had started working on Waverley through my student years in the catering department, and I can remember the excitement that we were getting a brand new Waverley, it seems. Now, she'd actually been rebuilt 2/3 at that point. It was only the funnels aft had been rebuilt. The forward section had not been done, and that was done in a subsequent rebuild phase, which came 3 years later. But it really felt at that time, Waverley now has a longer term future. We've got a ship from it's like 20, 25 years, and now I'm going, that's where we are again. So there's always ongoing investment in it. But when she went back to the same yard, we were not going to take the paddle boxes off and do all that. So she was put onto a barge in terms of the dry docking element. And you can see there it was the forward section of the ship that was rebuilt. There was other works that was still carried on from previous section, like for example, the whole ship then get new timber decks on the upper deck, which had been work that had been left over from the first phase. So the Heritage Lottery basically said we're kind of supposed to for the first bit, we've got to finish the job. So the second lot of funding did come at what seems reasonable ease. And then she looked really new. And she looked excellent. And by the time the work had been all completed, that was her in 2003, after the rebuild had been finished. Part of the aim of the rebuild was hopefully to reduce her winter maintenance costs, her ongoing costs. After a few years, found the cost of maintaining her in that condition was quite heavy, and there was no real benefit after that in terms of maintenance costs after the rebuild. So just to give an idea of then how we structure, if you like, the company and what she does. So the owning company is a registered charity. There's a board of directors, no employees. The directors are generally professional people who have an interest and enthusiast for Waverley. The day-to-day operations then pass to an operating company, which is wholly owned by the owning charity, Waverley Excursions. That is again board of directors. Directors are not paid. Executive management team of 3, of which I'm one, and then there's office employees and full-time crew that are paid through Waverley Excursions. We then have seasonal crew. The majority of crew on Waverley are seasonal. We have an office in Glasgow, where I mentioned just and exactly where she used to birth in Glasgow until the Clyde Arc Bridge, locally known as the Squinty Bridge, was built. That then pushed us, if you like, slightly downriver to the Science Centre. There are just 6 full-time staff and 2 part-time office staff. 2 full-time crew members currently, the Master and Chief Officer are full-time, and we do have part-time engineers over the winter. They're supported by volunteers in terms of carrying out winter maintenance work. We have to end up working with the MCA, so it's the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. That's who we deal with for all survey work on board the ship and for issuing the company document of compliance that we can operate the ship, and then the ship's own safety certificates, passenger certificates, etc., all issued directly through MCA. Crew of 26, and that just shows you the breakdown. So with the exception of the shopkeeper selling our souvenirs, then the crew are paid, they're professional seafarers. They've also got to have all the relevant certification. So the majority of crew are seasonal. We are very fortunate that some crew will come back year after year. They might take up other jobs through the winter months. I know with, for example, some of the deck crew have been coming back for several years, and it's the fact that Waverley offers quite a bit of variety. Some will say, well, it's not just going from the same port to the same port, because we do operate from over 60 ports around the UK. Every day is kind of different. It's a different programme, different sailing, different timetable. And that's the crew from last year, just at the very last day of the season. So in terms of maintaining the ship, there is a rolling survey programme with the usual annual items that many passenger ships will end up going through. We have an annual out of water inspection, so the dry docking, well, the usual firefighting equipment, life-saving apparatus, deck repairs, hull painting, annual. There's some things that are 3-yearly checked. Happens that the paddle wheels are surveyed every 3 years. And then there's other parts, major machinery, that's 5-yearly surveys. Now, rather than saying the hull is surveyed every 5 years, what we do is we break down the hull into sections. So we do a part each winter. Same with the main engine. It's a 5-year survey. So 1 year we'll do the high pressure, then 1 year the medium pressure, the low pressure, the bearings. So we basically split all the work up over a rolling programme. But 2019, during one of those inspections, the boilers that had gone in 2000 were found to have very small cracks in the furnace. And this came along as part of a 5-year inspection. That is the start of the press release that was issued, as it says there, on the 10th of May. And I remember that going out at 3 o'clock. And by 3:10, I had a request for an interview on the STV, 6 o'clock news, and the BBC wanted an interview on their Drive Time Radio Scotland programme and the 6 o'clock news that night. So it was apparent straight away this was a big story, because I'd gone with the heading "withdrawn from service," that was her withdrawing. Stop. And the reaction was immediate. The particular post on our Facebook page reached over 1 million. So it was being shared fast. At the point where we withdrew, the ship said, we cannot repair these boilers. We didn't know, we hadn't really budgeted how much it would be for new boilers. We had to do a bit of work on that. Within a month, we officially launched Save the Waverley appeal, knowing that we had to raise 2.3 million. To help launch the appeal, we invited people down to Wave for Waverley, just to give us a picture to go out to the press. They turned up. And I particularly like that, the SOS, Save Our Steamer. And it shows you the affection people have for this old paddle steamer. And the fact that even youngsters as well save the Waverley. So it just shows you the kind of the feeling. Local resorts around the Clyde coast, particularly within their Geln Butte district, where they see the benefit of Waverley because she arrives at places and 400 and 500 people step ashore. Dunoon, they ended up holding a Waverley Fun Day. The same happened in Rothesay, Campbelltown, Tinnabrook donated. So the places that the ship goes to in the Clyde all supported the appeal. Rothesay Primary School held a Waverley Day, whereas it says there, bring a donation, wear red, white and black and or navy blue and sing some songs. And the school went out and tried to make a Waverley in their playground, wearing the red, white and black. So that appeal saw 8,500 donations coming in, and the target was reached in 6 months. So from the launch appeal officially in June, by Christmas, Waverley had the money. Because this was 2019, COVID was coming, of course we didn't know at the time. But we applied to various trusts and foundations, with corporate donors, clubs and groups. So the money came from all different people. It was really during that time just trying to spread that we needed help. We also got 1 million support from the Scottish Government. And that was the government recognising that Waverley has an economic impact where she operates. An economic impact assessment back in 2015 had showed her to be worth 5.3 million to the UK economy and 3 million in Scotland. So the Scottish Government recognising that. That economic impact assessment has just been redone for 2023. Initial draft of that looks like her benefit has more than doubled in that time. So she found herself back in exactly the same berth where she had been sat after being withdrawn from service in '74 in the James Watt Dock, part of Dales Marine Facilities in Greenock, to be reboiled. And the funnels came off again. And those boilers that you saw going in 2000 will then coming out. You can see in the picture, people online will see if I move the mouse, you can see there where there is cuts into the shell. And that's where an attempt had been made to repair the boiler. But what we were finding was that as we were starting to repair, the cracks were spreading. And they were spreading into an area that had previously been repaired. And you don't do a patch and a patch. And that was the point we went to then say the boilers can't be repaired. That's looking from the bridge down into the boiler room. She was dry docked because there was still, we took the approach that the steel underneath the boilers had to be good for hopefully another 20 years. And therefore there was some steel work done. So she went into dry dock without the funnels and back on. It was all done once the boiler room had been emptied. That was March 2020. And she floated out 2 days after national lockdown had been announced. But the empty boiler room with the see there, the foundations for the boiler sitting, but you can also see in the corner a new Caterpillar alternator, because if you're going to lift off the roof and take out the boilers, you may as well do all the other equipment in that space. The alternators themselves had been 20 years and more, all the old ones that were there. So we ended up putting in new alternators. There was other bit of redesign in the boiler room space. The sewage treatment plant moved from one side to another. A new oily water separator went in as well. But instead of just being 2 alternators, we put in a third, a smaller harbour alternator. And the foundations for that can be seen just to the left of the other one. And that was her say we refloated just a couple of days into lockdown. I know when she got back round into the dock, I remember looking into the boiler room space and thinking, how do we put this back together? As contractors were leaving, it was only the shipyard that were able to keep going. And even then, the workforce was down steps at that time. But the boilers came. And it's a tight squeeze to get the 2 boilers sitting side by side in that space.
How's that for me? That's the noise. again.
And there's your kind of paddle steamer really kit, where you can see the funnels on the picture on the quay sides. The deck has now been put back in place where the funnels will go. The fiddly deck, as it's known, which is this steel deck that just covers the boiler room space. Of course, I got one picture that was very good of just having one funnel on, and I knew at the time, I thought, I know this is a good April Fool's. For people that care about the Waverley, she's got to look the same. So it was during that time, I remember posting an image of when they took the funnels off. There was only one funnel going back, and the response that they had got, but why would you dare only put one funnel back? But no, the two went back. Although that's a good image of her. As well as that, we had a bit of refurbishment work to do because areas of the ship that had been rebuilt 20 years previous were a bit tired in space in areas. So, for example, the dining saloon decking, that was all replaced because we'd actually had to do some work in the steel underneath the windows in the dining saloon. So the paneling had already come off. We were able to allocate some funding to refurbishment. But there is never an end where you can spend money on this paddle steam. 2020 though, she was back in service. She only got a couple of weeks that summer. We were also operating at a very reduced capacity. So say now we're certificated for 780. During COVID, we were really limited to 250. She needs about 550, 600 a day to really meet her costs. But it was right that we got her back into service, even for a short time, to show that, you know, people had donated to try and get her steaming again, and she was back in service. So a typical season tends to mean we dry dock in April for the annual works that require then the repair work, repainting of the hull. About 120 to 130 days in service from May, so really about mid-May she'll start this year till mid-October. She should hopefully reach about 60 ports and piers around the UK and the Clyde, Oban and Inner Hebrides, Mersey, North Wales, Bristol Channel, South Coast and Thames. Going back to last year, she had basically a phenomenal year. One of the best. It was more than I could ever hope for with her. She only lost 3 days through weather. There was no days lost through technical issue. She carried 157,000 passenger journeys, which was a 55% increase from the previous year. Ticket revenue, 3.2 million. Onboard catering from the dining saloon and the bars and the tea bar on board, and then the souvenir shop. So her average revenue per day was 37,000, which in 2022, similar was 26. This time last year, we were running an appeal to be able to afford the dry dock because she hadn't made enough in 2022. Following the COVID years, it's taken us until 2023 to really get her back operating in all the areas and do a full season. So it's been a sort of gradual building her back, but really last year, we were very lucky with the weather. The fact there was no technical, the amount of attention and press attention she got helped sell the tickets. But the costs do stack up, and that is only some of them. Notice there's no winter refit costs there, no insurance, office costs. But a typical year involves still cleaning boilers. You can say one of our crew members, it's one of the winter jobs, which has just been completed. Deck repairs, that's a photograph taken last November. We were forever deck repairs, about 200 metres of deck timber, tends to need to replace each winter. That's the same area, showing you the timber is now back in. An annual dry docking, that's her in the Garble dock at Greenock, again Dales Marine. All cleaning there, progress. You can see there on the picture, the rudder on Waverley is quite small. And if you think about the fact that propulsion is not near the rudder, it's in the centre of the ship. So there is no fast volume of water passes over the rudder. What does that mean? 6 knots and less, no steerage. She really does have to move quite fast. Her turning circle, 1/4 mile. You drive a paddle steamer quite fast in order to control her. As soon as she stops, the wind will just pick her up. So if you think of the funnels and the superstructure start to act almost like sails, if she comes into a berth and stops and there's a side wind, she will just go sideways. Just part of the survey work in that particular image, it's the paddle wheels being surveyed. As I said, they're an every 3-year item where we check all the welds, etc., on the wheels. That's within one of the lounges in the bar. The seating has been moved to access the hull, because that part of the hull will be due for survey. That's a photograph from last April. You can see there's some new steel work that's gone in over the paddle box, which is named Wave at that point, as you can see. Paddle wheels after survey, and they've been primed and then recoated. The picture that does allow you to see that the way the paddles are constructed